Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning in London. I'm sad that you are not here in person. It's a fabulous autumn day here in the British metropolitan city. Welcome to our webinar at Expert Forum on Energy Efficiency for Buildings. My name is Christian Kesberger. I'm the Austrian Trade Commissioner for the United Kingdom, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, other pieces of the empire that still exist. Today's seminar will be mainly conducted by the Trade Commission's expert, Peter Franklin. I'm sorry for that, Peter Franklin, who will lead through the program, introduce the speakers, but I would like to personally take a moment to express my gratitude to Chris, Tom, and Lynne for taking time out of their schedule and being with us today. Two quick remarks. This webinar is part of a sector focus program that will be followed by other events in spring. Peter, at the end of our proceedings, will talk a little bit about that. And the second one, it's a quite unusual format. We have done dozens of webinars on various topics, and they all were about 50, 60 minutes, and they were sometimes 100, 200, 400 participants. This requires stamina, it requires staying power, it requires dedication and focus, because it is for a small, dedicated, curious group of participants, but it also takes 2 hours, and it is the only opportunity really to quiz our experts in person. Because it's long, we will have a break session after the second presentation. In the break or during the break, I will do what I usually do in the beginning, a short recap of recent economic, political, pandemic developments in the United Kingdom. But all this information is available through other sources. So if you really need a coffee break, please take it and come back. I will be on the screen for about 7 minutes. This is it all for me. I would like now to hand over to my friend and colleague, Peter Franklin, to lead you through the program. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Christian, for that introduction, and welcome to everybody from around Austria and from around the UK who are tuning in today. This is, as Christian just mentioned, our first ever extended version of a webinar in the green building sector. These are exciting times. I do think that there's a real impetus behind the targets now, behind the strategy of the government to try and really get on with getting towards a zero carbon economy, and the green building and the green economy is actually very central to the UK government strategy. So this is a good moment really to really deep dive into what opportunities are coming up in the next years to come. We're really excited to have a panel of speakers this morning with a vast wealth of experience in not just the green building sector, but also in terms of the policy behind that as well. And I will echo what Christian has just said, in that we're lucky to have this experience with us this morning, and this expertise. And please use this opportunity. Feel free to answer as many questions as you'd like throughout the session, or feedback your comments, and we will endeavour to address as many of those questions both during the session, after each presentation, and we do have a dedicated question and answer session following on from the presentations. This really is, as Christian said, a great opportunity to tap into some real expertise in this sector, and particularly with regard to where this policy is going to shape the market coming up in the coming years, and what opportunities, but also what challenges that's going to bring. I would like now just very briefly then to go through what's awaiting you in the next 2 hours. Our first speaker in a moment will be Chris Ashworth. Chris is going to outline the UK construction and green building market, some of the levers, legislation, also routes to market, and give some tips about how you can really get involved and who you should be talking to. Following Chris, our next presenter will be Tom Jarman, and Tom's going to expand on that market and the development of the market, particularly what's changing, what's new in the market, what technological developments regarding digitalization but also in terms of how you need to be positioning your products in order to really utilize and understand those changes in the market and jump on board and make sure you're well positioned going forward. As Kristen's already mentioned, we then offer you a well-earned break, a coffee, maybe a second coffee. So yeah, recharge your coffee cups, sit back for a couple of minutes, listen to Kristen's dulcet tones while he gives his economic snapshot. But make sure you're back in place for our final speaker. It's only going to be a very short break. Our final speaker, we're really delighted to have Lynne Sullivan with us, and Lynne has vast experience, both as an architect, but particularly recently in helping to advise public sector bodies, local councils up and down the country here. Some of those councils that have been at the forefront of green thinking and implementing green policies. And that's going to be an invaluable insight into who you should be talking to, and particularly how you need to be approaching some of those bodies. So it's a really exciting program, and I'll say once again how important it is to take this opportunity to really ask any questions that you need answering today. Ask them early, ask them when they come into your head, and we'll endeavour to answer as many of those in the time that we have. We do have a final question and answer session following the presentations as well. So that's what's awaiting you. I'm now going to move on to our speakers and let them take centre stage, because that's what you're all here for. So let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Chris Ashworth. Chris has got over 35 years experience working with blue chip companies and SMEs in the construction sector. He was the founder of Competitive Advantage Consultancy, specializing in training, market research and implementing strategy, and he's advised companies in Europe, the UK and America. Chris has served on the UK government's Green Construction Board Promotional Working Group. He's been a member of the Construction Products Association External Affairs Committee, was a chairman of the BIM for M2 Promotional Working Group, and is vice chairman of the organising committee of the Chartered Institute of Marketing Construction Group. He's also co-organiser of the Construction Marketing Awards and is a regular speaker at conferences and a contributor to industry blogs and journals. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Peter. So good morning to everybody. I think I now have control over the slides, and I will move us on from there. So one of the things I was asked to do to prepare for this was to produce a report for this event. So we have put together a report looking at the UK construction market and in particular the sustainability opportunities, and this will be made available to you after this morning's presentations, and much of what I'm talking about will be referencing this. In terms of what I'm going to go through then, look a little bit at the construction marketing market overall, some of the government initiatives, some of the sustainability standards, industry drivers more generally, the decision-making process as how it works in the UK, local representation and its role as far as you might be concerned, and other thoughts on engaging with specifiers. So if we look at the UK construction market, it's started off very strongly at the beginning of this year, being very, very positive. Unfortunately, we're now starting to see a little bit of a slowing down. This is in part due to some of the restrictions introduced by Brexit. It's also linked very much to a shortage of delivery drivers. There's a general shortage throughout the country for all sectors. The supermarkets have been drawing in all the available drivers so they can maintain supplies of food to the country. And one of the consequences of this is that in the construction sector, the difficulty getting deliveries to both the branches, builders merchants branches, and also to construction sites. So while the overall demand is there and generally the mood is optimistic, at the same time, there are problems in supply at the moment. Also, the same applies with site labour. I'm just putting up a few slides that give you a bit of a picture of what the market's like. This is the housing sector, and it looks at the way the market's tracked since 2017, including the forecasts up to 2023. The pale blue represents the private housing output, and this is primarily where UK housing is constructed, as you can see. Those are private developers mainly who drive it. And then the dark blue is the public housing or social housing sector. And you'll see that 2020 took a dip, primarily because of the pandemic restrictions. 2021 is forecast to almost be back to the same level as 2019, but then it's showing a little bit of a dip after that. As I say, the state with the availability of delivery drivers and also site workers is the main influence now on whether we'll achieve those numbers. Other promising sectors with promise are the repair and maintenance side. Again, a bit of a dip last year, although actually a lot of homeowners who were stuck at home in isolation were doing a lot of home improvement works. But you can see again, the expectation is that this will really continue an upward trend that was started prior to the pandemic. So again, good opportunities there, primarily in the private sector. Education is a topic that the UK government has been talking about and committed to invest in, and we are anticipating again a growth in new school building, but also in the university and further education sectors. So you can see here the trend since 2020. And also we have the health sector. Again, another area where the government is committed to a lot of investment. It's expected to see an improvement over last year in 2021, and then a slight leveling off before it continues to rise again. But again, the availability of materials may well influence this. The other big area of expenditure is infrastructure, with HS2 under construction now, and a few other major projects that the government is committed to. And as with the others, you can see there was a bit of a dip in 2020, but then it's expected to continue to rise and grow. So overall, the UK market, I think, has a lot of promise in terms of opportunities once we get over the short-term frustrations linked to product availability and labour availability. And expectations are that that'll get sorted out in the next 12 months. That's the sort of general mood in terms of these things. If we look at government initiatives, COP26 later this year is a key focus for the UK government. I guess they're wanting to make a statement in the international scene, having left the European Union. So they've been working very, very hard to drive through initiatives or start initiatives in this country. The government has a 10-point plan of changes and initiatives they want to drive, and supporting that, there's an energy white paper which is looking at more energy efficient approaches. There's a UK hydrogen strategy to try and get more use of hydrogen to replace some of the other carbon-based fuels. There's a net zero innovation portfolio. Future Home Standard 2025, heat and building strategy, clean growth strategy, and the heat networks investment project. All of these things are initiatives the government's put in place and are about encouraging investment, innovation, moving forward. I'm just touching on them this morning because there isn't the time to go into it in any detail. But as I say, we've written a report which does explain this in much greater detail. But I think it can be summarized as saying that the UK government has put in a lot of commitment towards the sustainability net zero challenge. So in terms of sustainability, what are the standards, what are the measures that are used to take these things forwards? Some of them have been around quite a long time. Many of them are similar to the European Union's own systems. We have BS ISO 14001 as an environmental management system, LEED, which of course is a US-based system. The SCAR rating system, another way of evaluating buildings. The framework for responsible sourcing of construction products. And then there's the Code for Sustainable Homes, the Environmental Product Declaration, and the ISO Life Cycle Assessment. These are all different standards that are being used to measure performance and are used in different ways. Again, it's a bit subjective. There isn't a standard way of explaining these. So from that point of view, it's just at this point, be aware of it. But as I say, our report actually covers it. What about other industry drivers? Well, the key one is the planning process. For planning, we have a situation where there are certain sustainability requirements. Building regulations are then also driving the situation in terms of the detail of what's included in the construction of the house. We have the Building Safety Bill, which is coming along at the moment. I must apologize. I think we have an automatic advance on the slides, which are running it faster than I'd intended on this side of things. If the controllers can find a way of freezing that, I'd really appreciate it. The Building Safety Bill is in the process of being developed at the moment. This is going through Parliament and will see a new tighter set of codes. Of particular importance, I think, to the audience today will be the construction product competence requirement, which is looking at ensuring that anybody giving advice or guidance in terms of the use of products is competent to do it. Quite a complex issue, so there's a lot in terms of defining that. We also have under development the Code for Construction Product Information, which is also about defining the appropriate ways to present product information so it's clear, precise, and accurate. So both of those are things to watch and to be aware of going forwards. We also have the UK Conformity Assessment, which will be looking at the ability to conform to some of these issues, and we have digitization. So building information modeling, BIM, has been around for a number of years now. It's been quite widely identified in terms of the projects now. It's being widely used. We're starting to see the introduction of product identification. This will mean that products, once they're installed on site, will have either a chip in them, a barcode, or something that will allow subsequent identification to allow maintenance people to know exactly what it is that they're dealing with. And we're also starting to see the growth of the use of virtual, augmented, and mixed reality methods of people being informed and viewing projects. So there's quite a lot happening in new forms, new approaches, which any entrant to the market needs to be aware of. I'd now like to talk about the decision-making process itself. So this is how projects are decided, how they're defined, and it looks at these main groups of people: the client, the consultant, architect, contractor, and subcontractor. Starting with the client, who defines what they require. Generally, clients focus on aesthetics, but they will also look at some other key performance aspects that they may be familiar with. We then move on to the consultant, who looks at risk. So the consultants are taking an overview. They're considering issues around sustainability, in particular, energy efficiency, but also fire, acoustics, many other issues. So they define broad parameters that will need to be met in the design of the building. Following them is the architect, whose purpose it is to turn those concepts and ideas into a design. So they're working through this with input from the engineers to ensure that the design is correct. More recently, we've seen developments where a contractor's input can be brought in at an earlier stage than was previously the case. Having broadly defined the specification and design of the building, the contractors then get involved. They have their own input, and they will then select the subcontractors who will be actually responsible for installing the products on site. So all these people need to be influenced when it comes to introducing your products. They all have a say in it and have to be taken into account. They also have different areas of interest. So in terms of presenting products, what the architect wants to know is quite different to what the subcontractor wants to know. So it's important to recognize this and present the information appropriately. If we think of introducing your products into the UK, I would say that local representation is very important. It has the need to have that presence needs to be there. And in fact, as I said a second ago on that slide, the introduction of Brexit means that the import requirements are becoming more complex. So whereas previously it was just relatively simple to ship products from Austria to the UK, now there are, and increasingly going to be, more restrictions. For specifiers and contractors in this country, one of the key concerns is availability of stock. So again, having local representation and stock holding there is important to get your products considered seriously. And then the issue is, do I go for a specialist distributor or a general builder's merchant? And that depends very much on the products that you're offering and the nature of them. The specialist distributors will specialize in something such as pumps and drainage, water management. Maybe it might be the electrical sector, something of this nature, and have a broad range of products covering most manufacturers, whereas the generalist builders merchants tend to only carry one product of a particular type, but they have a very, they carry everything that you would need to put up a building. So these are key issues you need to think about when it comes to entering the UK market. If we look at the process of engaging with the specifier, then we have the first stage, which is awareness. And that's very much about making them aware of your products and the benefits those products represent. That might be achieved by putting details in product directories, advertising, exhibitions, attending exhibitions. CPD or technical seminars are a very, very good way of creating awareness. And then using the website, both through posting blogs and also social media to create awareness. So that early stage is the awareness creation, which makes specifiers know that your products exist and give them the desire to learn more about the product. We then come to the evaluation stage. So the specifier, having found out about the product, now wants to evaluate it and determine whether it is worth using or not. That might, well, most important of all is testimonials of some sort, case studies, references from third parties who've previously used the products and can give a positive message. Again, social media can be quite important in this, and of course emails and other web-based information to help them evaluate. And it's really important that they can access full technical information about the products. We then come to specification, and this is where the detail is required. So it's the product credentials, product literature, technical data sheets, if you have them, BIM objects. Product specifications, again, very, very important. You need this gambit of information to allow the architect or the engineer to accurately and effectively specify your product in their design. And then finally, we come to the purchase stage, which of course is the contractor rather than the architect or engineer. And here it's about making sure it's easy for the contractor to get the information they need about how to install the product. They know where to find the product, that it's available when they require it. Maybe there's training on site for their installers if it's different to other kinds of products. So in terms of thinking about introducing your product to the UK, this is the process you're going to need to follow to get it established. Then there's the case of product information that you need to provide. I just wanted to dwell on this a little bit. First of all, that brochure. You've got to have the product brochure, which details the product, gives images of what it looks like, provides all the necessary information. Technical data sheets are, again, an important source of information, and they're providing the background detail. And again, this is becoming increasingly important. I've referenced the Code for Construction Product Information, which is about ensuring that products are fully and comprehensively described. There have been criticisms in the past that perhaps manufacturers are a little economic with the truth, not putting out everything. So the technical data sheet is important from that respect. We then have the product specifications, again, very, very important, giving the detail of your product, defining what is important, what is different. And it's worth mentioning that with product specifications, this is very often the architect will say such and such a product or equivalent. And that means that your specification has to detail what it is that makes your product special, so that when deciding what's equivalent, those items are identified. As I mentioned earlier, project stories or case studies, really, really important. Examples of how the product has been successfully used on site, pictures of it in installation, quotes from architects and contractors stating how easy they found to use the product, its benefits, reassuring anyone who's considering using the product for the first time. Test reports, again, you need to have evidence to support your claims. And following the unfortunate Grenfell fire disaster, manufacturers are being required to provide far higher levels of information to support the decision-making process than they previously were. So you need to be aware of this and prepared to have those available. And as I mentioned earlier on, technical seminars, or as we call them in the UK, CPD, continuing professional development, a very effective way of reaching out to specifiers, making them aware of your products and the benefits those products provide. In terms of some key things to consider, a development that's happened, grown very rapidly in the last 2 years is NBS Source. This is a database of product specifications, but it's grown beyond that into a digital database which acts as a product directory, which can provide a lot of depth for manufacturers in terms of reaching out to specifiers and also contractors. So that I would suggest considering that. NBS Source, therefore, one of the key ones. In terms of other product directories, probably Barber ABI is the leading one behind NBS, and again, well worth considering as a way of making people aware of your products and the range they offer. Then we have the various industry journals, and there are a number of leading journals which you need to have a presence in. There isn't time to go through them here, but again, we have information on those. And increasingly journals are digital rather than hard copy, but again, many of the leading ones are in both formats. You need to have a presence in those. And then social media is very important. LinkedIn is probably the principal channel as far as the specifier is concerned. Facebook is, if you like, a passive way of sharing information. So what happens there is that people are perhaps not deliberately using it as a way of finding out about products, but somebody may share a project they've done, details of it. You see the image there. One of the supporting documents we have is the Construction Media Index, which is a research project that we do every 2 years to look at the main communication channels being used. So that actually looks at the proportion of the different specialisms such as architects and how much they use the various sources of information. So to summarize, the UK construction market is strong. There's definitely demand there. Unfortunately, we're experiencing some frustrations at the moment in the ability to deliver that demand. The UK government is committed to zero carbon and has many initiatives driving forwards. Brexit does mean that regulations are becoming more complicated, and while the UK is delaying some of these changes to allow implementation, it will change over the next year or two. So you need to be very aware of that. And for that reason, I would suggest working with a UK partner who can keep you informed and help you deal with any specialist testing that will be required. Overall, it's about creating awareness and demand with the specifier, making them aware of what your products are, what the benefits those products offer, and giving them the full technical information they need to make decisions. And as I say, we're seeing a situation where higher levels of information are being required. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. It's run rather faster than I'd intended due to the automatic advances that we seem to have got into the PowerPoint. But as I say, we published a report which you will receive a copy of, which gives much more detail than I could have time to cover in the short period now. And I'll also be taking questions at the end, along with the rest of the panel, when we get to the final session. So I'll leave it at that for now, Peter. I don't know if there are any specific questions you want to cover at this point.
Thank you, Chris. That was very interesting and very comprehensive. There are a few questions coming in. So I'm just one about the code for construction product information and also the construction product competence requirement. That's what are the implications for suppliers on that? And does that is that a requirement to train up? Will that imply additional training for architects and contractors, or indeed both?
Yes.
I don't know if you could say exactly.
Yes.
This is obviously a change that's coming down the line, or has come down the line.
In terms of competence, I think it's still being finalized in terms of exactly what's going to be required. But what it's saying is that in all aspects of construction, so design with architects and engineers, main contractors, subcontractors, and product manufacturers must all take action to ensure that the people that are making the decisions are competent to do so. Or in the case of product manufacturers and suppliers, the people giving the advice are competent to do it. So there will be various levels of qualification. I think the problem is that when you look at it in terms of individual product aspects, it's not something where, as an architect, you can just say, well, I've trained for 5 years and so I know it all. It's those specialisms in fire, in acoustics, in thermal insulation. And so there needs to be some kind of process in place for those people who are going to be designing or installing products to be trained in those levels. And that's the complicated bit. Personally, I think that represents an opportunity for the manufacturer to be part of that training process, because the people that know most about thermal insulation are the manufacturers of thermal insulation. So from the product manufacturer's point of view, I think it represents an opportunity to be doing more engagement, more of the technical seminars, things of that nature. But what it also, what it also means is that the manufacturer needs to be able to demonstrate that the people that are giving that advice are competent to do so. So they need to have some kind of documented process that says if somebody is giving advice on thermal insulation, for example, then they have been through an in-house training program to ensure they have those skills and competencies. So that's where all that comes in. And I think I'm right in saying it's a few months away from going public on that side of things. Code for construction product information, very, very quickly. That has just had its second consultation. I think they're trialing it with a few manufacturers over the coming months. And again, it'll be something that comes out at the end of the year. It'll be a voluntary code of best practice. And the idea is you sign up to that code. But at the same time, I would say have a look at it because it's best practice and it should be followed whether you commit to sign up to it or not.
Okay, that's great, thanks. Just a very quick another question. We've got to move on in a minute, but actually we mentioned about training and about imparting technical information. The CPDs, do offerers of CPD need to be registered in any way, or can anybody give a CPD?
Well, we come back to that level of competence issue, but it's not a mandatory requirement. So there are a couple of, well, more than a couple, a number of accreditation bodies in the UK for CPD, the most notable of which is the REBA, who will vet and accredit a CPD and also advise if they don't think that the content is suitable. But it isn't mandatory for architects to have one that's certified. However, it's a bit like a quality mark. So if you do have the approval and somebody's deciding between two different CPDs and one's certified and one isn't, the chances are they're going to go for the certified one. But many companies don't bother. Many companies who, I must say, mostly those who've got a well-established and therefore their reputation covers them, don't use them. So I'd say it's preferable but not necessary.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks very much, Chris. There are some more questions actually, but if you could stay on, it would be great. Yes. If you could join us at the end as well for some more questions and answers. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Okay, and I would like now to move on to our second speaker, Tom Jarman. Tom works with clients and organisations in construction, housing and infrastructure to create long-term value, improve resilience and maximise outcomes. Tom is a member of the Construction Leadership Council. He works in the Innovation in Buildings and Procurement for Value streams there. He's also a member of the advisory boards for Construction Excellence Northeast and the International Centre for Connected Construction. He's a member of the Chartered Institute of Housing and the Association of Environmentally Conscious Building. So Tom, welcome to the platform, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Excuse me, I'm a bit under the weather, everybody, so apologies in advance for throat clearing and possible sneezing. Much of my presentation picks up on themes that Chris has introduced, and I've got some summary points at the end that link back. Excuse me, but in terms of the presentation itself, I think okay, sorry, so I'm going to talk about what the challenge is in terms of UK construction. I'm going to pick up some key issues in construction that you may be able to speak to with your products, and also going to talk about how you can respond within this marketplace, which I'm going to talk about. I think the first thing is we all agree there is a very, very considerable challenge, and we can present it in a number of ways. I quite like this graphic because it shows the dramatic shift to warmer average temperatures in the past 25 years. You may have seen this diagram before. This is from Donut Economics, and this looks at both the ecological crisis and also the social aspect to that as well. So again, a different way to present what we agree is quite an alarming situation. And I don't know if you've heard of Earth Overshoot Day. This is announced every year. This is the point at which our demand exceeds what the Earth can regenerate. Globally, Earth Overshoot Day took place this year on the 29th of July. In the UK, it was on the 19th of May. And I looked up Austria, and Austria was the 7th of April, surprisingly. I thought you'd be more similar to us than you are. In the UK, so what's happening in the UK in response to this challenge that we're all seeing, that we're all facing? The first is climate emergency declarations. About 60% of local authorities have declared a climate emergency. They are now facing the somewhat trickier task of turning a climate emergency declaration into an operational plan for action. But it shows the extent to which there is a concern and the extent to which local authorities are responding to that. There's also consumer action as well, consumer demand. Unilever in particular have responded to this, and their view is very much that the ecological benefits of your product are a difference in terms of whether consumers have confidence in your company and will choose the products they want to buy. There's also Finance 2.0, which I think is an interesting emerging area to look at. The particular interviewee was saying, has been in this game for many years, was saying 15 years ago, if you had a concern about finance and how it linked to climate change, you were viewed as well-meaning but slightly odd. And now there's a raft of things that are happening that link finance much more closely to climate impacts. And you are starting to see this in the construction sector as well, in terms of financing deals for clients. And her view was very much that environmental and social impacts are now mainstream rather than niche or specialist. In the UK, we also have the Climate Change Act from 2008, which established the Committee for Climate Change. The government is obliged to consider the advice from the CCC, but it is considered very, very seriously and does link quite closely to policy. And the Climate Change Act also mandated carbon budgets set over 5-year periods, with the first one several years ago now. So let's have a look at these carbon budgets. You can see in this graphic how the carbon budgets are lined out in the columns. Excuse me, we have a fairly healthy trajectory so far, but looking at the 6th carbon budget in dark blue, which is the one of particular concern at the moment, because that's the one we're gearing up for, the trajectory starts to diverge quite rapidly away from where we need to be. This reflects that a number of relatively straightforward, I'm going to say straightforward with understanding the complexities, but they are to some extent the low-hanging fruit. So industry and power generation have made big gains in terms of carbon reduction. So we're starting to come to the much harder sectors of the economy now. And in addition to that, these figures were produced before the announcement in April, which made the 78% target law. So real challenges ahead. Homes, and I'm having a guess that the housing market is of particular interest to you, but homes are really interesting to me, partly as a housing specialist in this context, because they have a lot of untapped potential. They're one of the areas where we have the most ability to move, and they are also relatively controllable. The housing marketplace is highly regulated. That does mean it responds to regulation. I want to talk a bit now about productivity as a key concern of the construction sector. There's lots of quotes here that highlight how much of a concern it is. So there's lots of words there which are a bit alarming: dire, woeful, notoriously weak. And for a construction specialist like me, this was quite sad to see. The construction industry is a poster child for feeble productivity growth. Excuse me. So this is from the Chartered Institute of Building. This is a fairly common graph. There's lots and lots of sources for this graph, which basically show sectors of the economy and the economy average increasing since the baseline, and the construction productivity broadly flatlining. There's a number of reasons for this, and I suspect they're all interconnected. If you look at digitization by sector, construction is at the very bottom above agriculture and hunting. So it's not a highly digitized sector, has a lot of room to catch up. A really important report. I always say that if you want to understand how the UK construction sector works in reality, read Modernise or Die. This is 5 years old now, but it's very, very blunt in terms of the culture of the marketplace that you are trying to speak to. Chris's slides in terms of how you were taught to that marketplace, I think were very, very helpful, and I would pay a lot of attention to them. But with this reality in mind, a survivalist business model, the absence of alignment, and the absence of the incentives and means to invest. I'm not personally convinced most clients particularly understand productivity. I think this is really interesting from our man from Toyota, who was one of the originators of lean philosophy. And those 4 things there, easier, better, faster, and cheaper, are very, very clearly in that order, with cheaper absolutely last. And you are trying to reach out to a marketplace that generally puts cheaper first. But I think until we understand the correct order of how we approach things, it's going to be difficult to approach productivity at a client level. The industry, therefore, is currently dominated by what I call BRLC, or building regs, building regulations at lowest cost. So most clients have a performance standard which complies with regulatory requirements, but doesn't push much above it. Procurement is via lowest capital cost. There is very, very little post-occupancy monitoring and evaluation. So I don't really understand how clients can understand if they've done things properly if they don't have an effective post-occupancy regime. And there is also a performance gap, which is the difference between a building in design and a building in operation. And generally the operation is worse than the design specification. And this creates risk. It creates risk in terms of the financial impact of higher energy prices, but also ventilation, condensation, damp, risks to occupants associated with that. I think this is quite an interesting graphic from Project 5 a few years ago, but it emphasizes that most of the construction sector is in good, but not much of it, excuse me, is better. And the dominance of price as a means to understand a product is, for a large reason, is largely responsible for that predominance within good. We'll come back to this graphic later on. So what is the response to this productivity challenge? Excuse me. Unlike Modernize or Die, transforming infrastructure performance isn't mandatory reading, but it is of interest because it does represent a sea change in government thinking away from cost and towards value and outcome. This was reflected in the construction sector deal, which was part of the wider industrial strategy. And this taught much more in terms of what you can unlock. So if you want to talk to the government about investments, about your sector, they are much more interested in talking about what value you can bring and what outcomes you can drive and how they can understand this as a whole life cost proposition. Now, this hasn't permeated through the construction sector fully yet, but it does mean that if you have a product that speaks to value and speaks to outcome and speaks to good whole life cost productivity, then it gives you an opening to talk about that with clients. There was also the transforming construction investment, £170 million of government investments and £250 million match from industry invested broadly in those programs. This was an enormous investment in bringing value and productivity back into construction. One of the outcomes of that is the Construction Innovation Hub's Value Toolkit. This is still at an early stage, it's in the early adopter stage, but it means that as a client, you have a mechanism to talk about what you want to do, not in terms of a deliverable like a building or a bridge or something like that, but in terms of what that output wants to achieve. And it also gives you a mechanism to understand the choices you make. So we are starting to see toolkits that are pushing clients towards more sophisticated, active client decisions, which again, if you have a product that is more based around performance and value and quality, is of real benefit to you. The last bit is about the construction playbook, which starts to drive some of this, these intentions around productivity, digitization, whole life cost, value and outcomes into government clienting. So this is written for government departments, but nonetheless, government departments procure about 40% of construction output, so it's still very significant. There was a really interesting quote here from Rupert Soames some years ago. The objective of government procurement should not be to create a market in which the only bidders are the dumb or the desperate. And we are definitely moving away from that now. As someone who's been involved in construction for a number of years, that's a huge relief. Carbon. So embodied carbon is the carbon used to produce a product. The operational carbon is what your building or structure produces during its operational life. Cement and steel are big emitters within the construction sector, which is why the construction sector has so much to say in terms of decarbonisation. There is an assumed link with off-site manufacture, which we'll pick up in a few minutes. But just to make you aware of some terminology that's emerging within the UK, or is established really within the UK. We talk about MMC, modern methods of construction, instead of off-site manufacturing. And another way of understanding MMC and offsite is through this pre-manufactured value, which is hyperlinked for future reference. Construction 2025, published in 2013, started to push towards much lower emissions and pick up carbon within construction. Chris referenced the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and from a construction point of view, the response is the Construct Zero program, which is starting to generate metrics that measure that journey. Again, if your product can talk to those metrics, then you will have an interested client group. because the construction sector now has a way to start to measure that journey. And also there's lots coming out from the professional institutions. There's the REBA Climate Challenge, the Architects Declare. But this does mean, in terms of the specifiers that Chris referred to that you will be speaking to, you can reference these documents. My advice is find the people who have signed up to these and to take them seriously, because they're the people you can have a good, serious conversation with. The REBA plan of work, which again was referenced very briefly by Chris, but the plan of work is how a lot of architects in the construction sector structure project progress and project design. And this is starting to have outcomes, post-occupancy and sustainability written into it. So again, the environment that you're talking to is starting to change in a very positive way. There's a couple of other professional responses. The CIC has a climate action plan. They consist of about 200 professional organisations, professional institutions. The Institution of Civil Engineers is really, really serious about driving carbon out of construction. So digital, I'm rushing slightly just because I'm looking at the time, but you will have a copy of these so you can refer to them in a bit more detail subsequently. Chris referred to BIM, Building Information Modelling. There's a couple of definitions there. The digital representation of a facility, shared knowledge resource over the course of its life cycle is broadly how we define it. But I like this one from the NBS. BIM is not architecture, it is data management. And you need to think of it in terms of these three things. It's a virtual system, it's data rich, and it's output focused. So all of the things that Chris was saying about the product information, the manuals, the specifications, you can build all of this into your BIM object, and then architects can build it into their BIM model. And then they have a very data-rich point of reference focused around your product. This is an example from manufacturing. So previously, to understand how a plane would perform, they used to bend its wings until it broke. That doesn't happen now. It's all digitally done. It's all carried out digitally. Construction is still catching up. But there are loads of benefits to an effective BIM model. These were comments made to me by people I used to work with. We can't manage buildings without data. We're missing opportunities because we don't have data. And Paul Thomas, who is a key author of these two documents, you're going to save money by not looking for data. So if you have a data-rich BIM object, there are people you can talk to that will open up opportunities for you. The other benefit to clients that you can speak to in terms of BIM is this quote from Rob. It's really cheap to make mistakes on the model. So there's a lot of advantages to clients using BIM, and especially architects. It tends a lot to be architect driven, but therefore by you having your product as a digital object, you are feeding into those advantages. And also BIM will underpin the golden thread, which is one of the things developed under the Hackett review, which was the response to the horror that was Grenfell Tower. I'm just going to show this video from Great Portland Estates, which will give you a 30-second break from me talking. But this is what you can do with BIM. Oh, sorry, slide beforehand. James was speaking at BIM Show Live. BIM Show Live takes place in Newcastle, which is where I live, just on the coast. There's some outstanding views of our northeastern coast. Colour Coast Coffee is my spiritual home. And if any of you do come to Newcastle, please get in touch. The first person to do so will get a California t-shirt. So this project here was a Great Portland Estates project. They rent commercial office space to clients over the long term. This was a construction project they were involved in where they had to raise the facade of a building in London. And the point that James was making was that this wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. Without BIM, they couldn't have designed this and modeled it safely. So BIM allows you to put lots of information into your project model. It allows you to run simulations repeatedly. And this is the point about allowing you to digitize risk. So this isn't me selling BIM so much. This is more me emphasizing the advantages of considering what the digital side of your product looks like, and therefore how you can use that to talk to potential clients. There we go, facade raised. So how do you navigate? I mean, I love the construction sector, but it is very, very frustrating at times. So how do you navigate it? What we're talking about does create a marketplace for you. Value and outcome is the response to the productivity challenge. Carbon means there is very clear client demand for solutions. I'm using client quite loosely. A client could be an end user. It could be a local authority or social landlord. It could be an architect. It could be a main contractor. But they are all clients and they all have demand for carbon orientated solutions. And digital, so what does your digital offer look like? Do you have your product as a digital object? The data richness means you can talk to people about how operationally effective it is, about how it performs. And it also means that at design stage, it is more able to be integrated, whether that's new build or retrofit or infrastructure. They're all slightly different challenges, but it means it can be integrated. Risk can be digitized, performance can be modeled. That makes it very, very useful. And then that in turn links to post-occupancy monitoring and evaluation. This is a bit of a minority sport, but clients are increasingly using this to understand performance and whether what they intended to do has translated into practice. Again, if you have products that can talk to that and have a digital aspect that means they can understand it, then you can align better with those clients. There's a lot of focus on off-site manufacturing. There's a very clear feeling that it is a good way forward in terms of productivity and carbon, and to some extent it is. This view here, because something is built in controlled conditions, it is better, is very predominant, but it's not necessarily true. This is an Austin Allegro. You probably don't see many in Austria for very good reason. It was built in a factory, but let's just say it wasn't a particularly good car. This is a housing development I was involved with, an off-site manufactured units built in a factory, and this is all the air leakage and cold bridging that frankly shouldn't be there. So you do need to think through about how I would advise you to think through about how you talk through your products in a way that help clients understand what good looks like and what challenges you can work with them to navigate. Chris mentioned this in terms of product competency. So manufacturers are the best placed people to talk about the product they manufacture. On the other hand, clients need to know what good looks like. You need clients to ask the right questions at the right time to the right people. The more you can help them to do that, the more value your product and your service will be to them. There's also organisations like Energiesprong UK. If you are purchasing Energiesprong, you are purchasing heat, power and hot water over 30 years. If you have a product where quality and performance are much more important than lowest capital cost, these are the people I'd advise you to reach out to. And for this reason, Energiesprong is band A, and so there's a very clear net zero challenge there. And the supply chain has enormous incentive to make sure they get there, because they need to do it consistently for 30 years. If you are confident that's your marketplace, there's that sort of opportunity starting to emerge. Very quick word on BIM. BIM is largely dependent on hosted libraries, which are internet-based downloadable web content. There are two principal ones. NBS source was mentioned by Chris, the National BIM Library. This is the old post office in Newcastle. Newcastle is a global centre for BIM, so please come and visit us. The other one is BIM Store, again, also based in Newcastle. I would talk to these people about what your digital object could look like and what hosting they can offer you. And there's a note there about some more specialist ones. I suppose the key thing for me, those people tend to divide the construction sector into particular client groups. And I don't think they divide that helpfully. There are some major retail builders who are home builders who are investing much more in performance and quality and the products and supply chains they'll need for the future home standard than others. Local authorities and social landlords who you'd think over a longer period of time because of the assets they hold for a long period of time are actually very, very cost driven. But on the other hand, there are some very significant exceptions such as Exeter and Norwich, which have significant passive house programs. Build to rent is really interesting, long term, low yield, and they're very, very closely, they understand very well the impact of a poor decision at capital investment stage on operational impact. And because they're a long-term low yield model, operational impact is very, very significant to them. So if you have a good quality product that will perform well over a long term, the build to rent sector might be a good sector for you to consider. Commercial office space, again, as we saw from Great Portland Estates, they are very, very closely connected to what their clients demand. Their clients are increasingly demanding low carbon buildings, and they are very good at putting that into practice. And they want to talk to people who have products and services that can help them do that effectively. And infrastructure. Infrastructure is of real interest because we have the National Infrastructure and Construction Pipeline that looks 10 years ahead. And you can see there how they summarize the scale. I keep talking to clients about talk in terms of your ambition and the consistency of your ambition and what that budget looks like that you're asking the supply chain to respond to, because then you get very different answers in terms of quality and performance and in terms of supply chain partnerships. And infrastructure are good at doing this. This is how they articulate what they're going to do. What's of interest to me as well, there's a point at the bottom about infrastructure maturity. We have a lot of infrastructure, as you will in Austria, in this country. We could spend billions and billions and billions tomorrow, and we wouldn't significantly increase the infrastructure stock. So it's much more about making it work better. There is that need to invest in renewing, but it is as well about how a mature infrastructure operates and the role of digital in terms of how it can operate better, how you understand performance, and how you can understand the outcomes over the long term. So infrastructure is a good sector to talk to if you have products and services, again, that are focused on those long-term outputs that you are confident will perform better, not because they're cheaper, but because they're good quality and well designed, and you have thought through your installation and maintenance and everything else. So Chris touched on this as well. Because the construction sector in the UK is highly regulated, there are some absolute basics you need to get in place or you will not be able to access it. An interesting comment from someone I work with, a product developer. He was saying that if you have a new product, people are not going to touch it with a barge pole unless you have all the accreditation. So there is some good advice there from Chris about understand, I would suggest as he does with a UK partner, about what those accreditations look like, because you do not want to get caught out at the end of a process by not having the right accreditation within the full set. And also, it will take time to build confidence. Again, referring back to Chris's presentation, I thought he had some really good ideas about how to build that confidence, about the role of engaging with peer networks, talking to people, getting information out there on social media, going to events, going to conferences, building some case studies with partners. It's a very heavily regulated industry. You can't just start selling, you have to create confidence. So you may need to invest in a pilot program with a construction partner. It could be a social landlord, they're quite keen on pilot programs, so that you have a case study that you can show as an example in practice of what your product does. So there will be quite a lot of work to do in terms of confidence building. So, and I think this is my last slide. The key questions for me is, for your product, how does it fit into this emerging world of productivity and carbon and digital? How are you going to talk about it, and who are you going to talk about it to? how are you going to maintain your confidence? If you have a high value performance driven product in a marketplace that is quite cost focused, you are going to have to be quite self-confident about what your market offer is, and you will probably have to be quite persistent to find the right people to talk to. They are absolutely there. There was sorry, there was something I thought I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. But those people which you need to talk to with that type of product are there, but there is confidence building to do, and there is quite a lot of work to find where they are. Great, and that is indeed my last slide. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and hopefully that was useful.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was a really interesting insight. There's a couple of quick questions that perhaps we could ask now. You've just mentioned about accreditations. There are a number of different accreditations. Do you have any advice on where suppliers should go to get more information on which accreditations they need?
There's a couple of accreditations aren't my strong point, but there's a couple of places I would go. One is somebody I suspect, I don't know Chris very well, but I suspect someone like Chris will have a good handle on what the full set of accreditations looks like, given the market research that his company do. So I would suggest a conversation with someone like Chris. There's also organisations like the BSI, the British Standards Institute, as well. And again, they tend to produce a lot of technical documentation, some of which was referred to by Chris. But I suspect a conversation with someone like the BSI would be helpful as well. There's also the Construction Products Association. Again, I don't know them very well, but I wonder if, because of the nature of their work, whether they would also have a good view on what the full set might look like.
Okay, and you mentioned I've got a question here, is how realistic are the government stated targets, and how much faith can we have in them sticking to these targets? And I think you mentioned earlier about this probably goes towards your mentioning there's a specific sectors which are driving this for both in public and private areas, but the UK is lagging behind, of course, in terms of, or the construction sector is lagging behind in terms of taking up new technology compared, for example, for manufacturing. So and the dependency on price by many people. So I guess that all ties into that. So how realistic do you think those government stated targets are, and how much faith can we have in them going forward in the long term?
There's a couple of ways to answer the question. I would have faith in them because they are there in law and they have political consensus. And we know as a society we need to get there. The governments do tend to message these things in a way that is unhelpful. So I would advise people to see beyond the messaging, because there is a very clear direction of travel, even though some of the policy implementation I think is quite clumsy. But to some extent, the government as a client, I pulled up that document, the Construction Playbook, and that is very clear in terms of key government departments. So defence, justice, education, health, and defence. I might mention, anyway, there's 5 of them. Transport is the 5th. In terms of those key government departments, they are mandated now to procure on the basis of value and outcome. So previously it was a case that you were asked to do it, but there wasn't a consequence if you didn't. Now it is the case that you have to do it, and if you don't do it, you have to explain why you didn't do it. So in terms of the long-term direction of travel, and in terms of government practice, there is a lot there that means I think we should have confidence. In terms of the construction marketplace that you're trying to talk to, I think it does mean you need to work hard to find the people that get that understand it, that you can have a conversation with about performance and value. But that's always been the case. I just think you're working in a more benign environment now. But again, the advice that Chris gave, the way that Chris structured who you should talk to when, I thought was very sound advice. And I can see yourselves as a trade commission having a linking role in terms of those networks to get your client group there, your Austrian companies there, because there will be people there that want to talk about the right things.
Yes,
we're working in an environment that is more interested in those things now.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and the fact that so there really is a readiness for taking on board these ideas going forward in the long run. And of course, you mentioned, and perhaps it's a good point for us to mention to companies who are listening in, of course, after this event as well. If that brings in any sort of desire for more information or more knowledge, please get in touch. You will have our contact details at the end of this event as well. Tom, thanks very much. Will you be able to stay on for further questions at the end of the session?
Absolutely, yeah. Very happy to.
Good. That's a really good presentation. Lots to take in. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
And now we have the well-earned break. It's going to be a 5-minute break or so for recharging your cups, or for listening to the latest installment in Christian Kessberg's economic briefing. And I'm going to hand straight over now to Christian. Please make sure you're back in 5 minutes if you are going to the coffee pot. And we have Lynne Sullivan to follow very shortly. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, Peter. Again, I can see where you are, so if you step out, I am not offended. And as I said in the beginning, all the information that I will kind of try to put together for you is also available in various downloads and publications of the Trade Commission, or in a phone call that you have with me. I was personally fascinated by the two presentations, and yes, Tom, I might take you up on your promise for a colorful T-shirt. Newcastle is basically on my bucket list for this year. Let's look at the basic situation in the UK. I mean, nobody can understand anything if you don't know what the pandemic has done to individual countries. Great Britain was suffering more from the onslaught of the virus than continental Europe. Many reasons for that: a weak health system, social inequality, high population density, but also politics dragging their feet in the beginning. Boris Johnson took a while to go from get Brexit done to get COVID managed. That was all followed by a very courageous and also very successful vaccination campaign that kind of put Britain ahead in the international rankings for many months. Today, the UK is stuck with the same kind of, average vaccination rate than many other than the European Union and any other countries. About 65% of the overall population are vaccinated, and it seems to be difficult to edge this figure up fast enough. So the government has kind of decided on a plan B to avoid us the NHS to be overloaded by a winter surge. We will probably revisit compulsory mask wearing or vaccine passports in a later stage. And I think to all of you in Austria that might sound somewhat familiar. Let's look at the economic developments. Great Britain is still the 6th largest economy in the world. Large service sector, about 80%, exports 40% also come from this service sector. It's still challenged by the old things that were there before Brexit, before the pandemic. We have heard it: low productivity, wide regional disparities, high housing costs, low public investment. Government is stable at the moment. The Conservatives have an 80-seat majority in the Commons, and are expected to remain in power until the next elections in 2024. There was extraordinary pandemic support for households and businesses. And there were also tax incentives for investments. I think of the super deduction scheme that's going to run until April next year. But there was also, of course, a major onslaught by the virus on, economic developments. GDP contracted by about 9.8% in 2020. The first quarter of 2021 was a minus 1.8%. Still not great news. But then, of course, Britain brought in the harvest of the vaccination campaign. The GDP of the second quarter was up, was plus 4.8%. The rebound of private sector consumption was much stronger than forecasters expected. So everybody upped its expectations for the entire year from like 5-point-something% to 6-point-something%. Britain's economy is supposed to grow by 6.6% this year, and then another 5.6% next year, meaning might return to where it was in 2019 by the end of 2022, the last quarter of 2022. However, they are now very disappointing signs. We have heard them. Of course, there is shortages in labor, shortages in component, shortages in energy. There is a pandemic. There's too many people being sent to quarantine. And there is, of course, the scaling back of government support that we are going to experience in the next couple of months. So there was a very disappearing result for July. The GDP only grew by 0.1%, was supposed to grow by 0.67% in June. The plus was 1. So we don't know exactly, again, in which direction this is going. Is it going to be slower than expected? Is it going to stay on the same trajectory and the same kind of very positive trajectory that we saw? We also realized that trade agreements with the United Union leaves many aspects of the relationship unsettled. There are significant non-tariff barriers. There's many webinars on our YouTube channel that you can re-listen and re-watch webinars that we did on some of these or most of these hurdles. And there's, of course, lots of dissatisfaction in Northern Ireland and Scotland that might pose political problems, challenges to the political stability of the country in the future. One also has to bear in mind that the UK is one of the 8 European Union countries that has a debt to GDP ratio above 100%. It's about 108%. Borrowing costs are now manageable, but the dangerous thing is inflation forecasts have been raised above 3%. The government, the chancellor, says it's transitory. So it's widely expected that the Bank of England will keep the interest rate at 0.1% throughout 2021 and only start tightening the interest framework from late 22. But of course, there are, as I have mentioned, a number of risks to this upward trajectory in the economic development, inflation forces, a wave of business failures. We don't know how many businesses will actually survive when there is no more government support programs. And then, of course, the question if the tax increases, the announced tax increases will stifle the economy. The British government, because of budget deficits and the necessity to finance a health system that is still challenged by the virus and challenged by backlogs, has decided not only to up the corporate tax rate from 19 to 25% in April 23, but also announced an increase of national insurance contributions and the dividend tax for next year. And that's, of course, unsettling the business community, unsettling investors. A few words about the exchange rate. If I would really know how it's going to go, I would be in the Bahamas and not here. But after years of volatility and political uncertainty related to Brexit and the pandemic, the pound sterling has appreciated against the euro in 21 as the Brexit uncertainty dissipated, and it should continue to appreciate from 1.08 at the end of 2020 to approximately 1.20, 1.19 by the end of 21, and kind of stay there for the foreseeable future. that was basically it from me. I hope you gained something. I hope you're back at your screens for our last presentation that goes right to the topic, energy efficiency for the construction sector. Peter, it's back to you again. Or not? Good.
I'm back. I've rushed back. I was here with you. I promise. Thank you very much for that snapshot, Christian, that update, and welcome back if you did, unlike me, if you did slip away. Our final presenter this morning, I will introduce now, is Lynne Sullivan, and Lynne is chair of the Good Homes Alliance, a board member of the UK Passive House Trust, and has advised successive UK governments on sustainability in the built environment. Lynne was awarded OBE for services to architecture in 2011, and she is leading a task force for the Green Construction Board to examine the journey that the construction industry needs to go on in order to meet its carbon targets. As an architect, Lynne was a finalist for 3 years in a row for the BRE National Passive House housing competitions. So really looking forward to hear what Lynne has to tell us about working with the public sector councils and much more. Lynne, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for asking me to speak today. Yeah, I'm working with Scottish Government and the Green Construction Board, UK Government, and also with the Mayor of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and indeed the states of Jersey. So I'm kind of, I guess, advising in several sectors. But there are a lot of questions as well, although the biggest question, of course, is how we make the built environment resilient for climate change. So let me just make my slide move on. Oops, that's not working. Great start. Thank you. I'm just clicking on my laptop here, so I hope that's working. So yes, I'm sure you're only too aware of the bigger picture on climate change and why we have the urgency to react. Of course, we are all experiencing direct impacts now of a changing climate. And what's really interesting is, although the UN Sustainable Development Goals were set before COP21 in 2015, actually it's the social justice element which is really the key issue, I think, certainly for local authorities and combined authorities as far as my work is concerned at the moment. So how can this transition be equitable for the less well-off members of society? Yeah, Peter, sorry, someone's going to have to progress this because it's not working. Thank you. Yeah, so one of the interesting things, I don't know if you can cast your mind back to Copenhagen COP, whether you're avid COP followers like me, but there was a surprising, really, and welcomed emphasis from business saying that we needed to change. And now, 10 years or so later, we have a real groundswell of enthusiasm from the investor community. And one of my children actually is operating in the carbon neutral space for big companies, and his company produced this world's top 50, the Fortune 500, the world's top 500 companies index, showing how many of them have now committed to net zero carbon, many of them by 2030. And so the real crux of the issue is, how can we leverage the enthusiasm of the finance community to help this transition? That's, of course, globally, but particularly in the UK, given current context. So we've set up something called Green Finance Institute, and as a member of the Green Construction Board, we have been liaising with them, particularly on buildings retrofit, and they are shortly to launch their version of a proposal about building renovation passports. But I know that concept is quite mature in Europe, so because it combines the idea of more accurate knowledge about the performance and the condition of a building with a digital database, and therefore the potential to exploit opportunities at scale. So, and also this idea of launching a green bond, and so I'm sure you have these things elsewhere, but it's indicative of this desire from the investment community to invest given the right conditions. So next slide, please. So in the UK, obviously we have a so-called world-leading commitment for net zero by 2050, or indeed 78% reduction by 2035, as it's more recently been interpreted. And so these, in terms of the built environment, this commitment clearly has to cover new buildings, retrofit, the provision of renewable energy, and also related to, I suppose, potentially offsetting, but certainly greening and biodiversity regeneration. So the key issues for our industry are, how we tackle this. So far, the government's proposals have not had, let's say, overwhelming support from our independent advisors on climate change, the Climate Change Committee, because there is a notable difference between, what the government have put out as a kind of prescription for net zero new buildings, net zero ready from 2025, and what the Climate Change Committee have said. Basically, the Climate Change Committee's view, and meant from many of us in the practitioner community and the industry, say that from 2025, it must mean that new buildings do not need to be retrofitted between now and 2050. So they need to be genuinely net zero ready. So the issue is quite what that means. Also, the government have been criticised on their rather piecemeal approach to retrofit programmes, and there have been some notable failures, like, for example, Green Deal, and leaving a lot to be covered by the energy supply companies, the energy efficiency commitment. So we're really looking. Well, a lot of us have been working, and local authorities now want to grapple with this issue and want to deliver a proper journey to net zero because they have committed. Yeah, sorry, do press on, please, the next slide. So quite where we are, this is a lot to take in, but you will get a PDF of this. But yes, the key sort of flagship policy announcement was that the Future Homes Standard, which effective from 2025, should have world-leading energy efficiency and have non-fossil sources of energy. But that has now converted into a version which has been put out for consultation by government, which says 75 to 80% reduction in CO2, which sounds really promising, but that is over existing, which means, it's benchmarked to our existing way of calculating this, which is a notional calculation. It doesn't cover all energy. It only covers the more narrow definition of so-called regulated energy. So it doesn't include, for example, plug-in loads. And indeed, in places that overheat, that would include air conditioning. So question mark really about that. I actually chaired the government's review on behalf of the Building Regs Advisory Committee in 2012 for the last energy efficiency regulations in the UK, Part L. And shockingly, that's almost 10 years ago. We still haven't got a firm proposal for the next review, let alone a precise definition of the 2025 prescription, if you like, for this future home standard. And of course, many of our largest developments are, 10-year plans. So people really need to know this, and certainly from the local authority perspective, that is absolutely key. The sixth carbon budget it is very helpful. It was produced in 2020. That's from the Climate Change Committee. And there are many issues which I'm sure you're only too familiar with too. The issue of consumption emissions versus territorial emissions. You know, we have to, hopefully COP will come up with something on this, because there is a yawning gap. In our case, in UK's case, something like 40% differential between what we produce at home and what we basically consume by imports. So we have to be able to control the carbon emissions of that. We have to introduce accountability into that system. One of the key issues that Climate Change Committee have reiterated is that at the moment, because of this notional calculation in building regulations, you know, we cannot have precision. We must have better verification of the outcome of building performance, because otherwise we are floating in a world of imagination, really. We need to verify performance, and this is also an issue which has come up with the golden thread of the Building Safety Act following the Grenfell fire. And I was speaking on a platform with Dame Judith Hackett, who has led the Building Safety Review, and actually we were saying very much the same thing about more accountability, more verification, more precision on what goes into a building, and measuring, making sure that it does actually happen, that it's installed correctly and that it performs as it was intended. So there have been a number of people lobbying for better verification of performance. And indeed, the government have their own programme of smart meters, and there is a programme called SMETers, which is from the Department of Business, which is developing a more sophisticated version of smart meters to enable verification of performance literally live. You know, we're really looking forward to having that in front of developers who say their buildings are going to perform as they should, and in fact we're very well aware the performance gap exists. So there are some other more overarching commitments, like, for example, I think it's 12% of our companies, in other words our largest companies, have a requirement to report annually their actual energy use annually, and also the carbon emissions from that. So it's that, you know, it's like the left hand says one thing and the right hand's saying a different thing. So some of us, and certainly myself as chair of Good Homes Alliance, have campaigned for a long time for better prediction of performance and verification of performance. But we're waiting for two key strategies to come out from government, which we think will come before COP, between now and COP. One is the overarching net zero strategy from Treasury, and the second is the heat and building strategy, which is obviously a key issue for our sector, particularly regarding initiatives on retrofit. So yeah, next slide. I mentioned before, we're waiting for the heat and building strategy. This is really to do with supply side. This is how we're going to plan for our renewable energy. I think that one of the earlier speakers mentioned the 10-point plan. You know, there's a big hope that we will maximise our offshore wind capability, but it's not going to be an overnight panacea. We definitely, with our electrification of transport as well, if we're going to electrify buildings in anticipation of a decarbonised grid, we're going to have a massive hit on our electricity supply. So so we really need to reduce the demand in buildings from the very outset, and this includes obviously retrofit, because we know we have 20 million homes that need retrofit. Okay, next one. Sorry, next slide, please. Within the context of, I think I've said this sixth budget has been interpreted as 78% reduction by 2035, and the key thing on this is that is a good ambition, but we need to really nail the precise ingredients. So robust enforcement is needed. Ultra high standards of energy efficiency, that's not absolutely clear. The current draft notional specification has more or less passive house fabric standards, but not necessarily controlled ventilation via mechanical ventilation and heat recovery ventilation. And yeah, there's a big question still about this performance gap, which is that buildings are not performing as intended, and the system is not geared to check that. And in fact, that consultation on the future home standards, 72% of the people responding said this wasn't ambitious enough. So there's a little bit of tension at the moment in the sector on the government proposals, the ambition versus the underpinning requirements. So next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the social justice element is coming into play, and this is something which has driven a lot of local authorities to make commitments in response to climate emergency. And there's been a national climate assembly, so getting kind of the people's voice on this. And of course, you'll have read and seen in the news all the thing about Insulate Britain and holding up the London orbital route, etc. It's really important that the public can feel that they're part of this journey. So there's a big communications issue, and there's a big issue to connect those financial opportunities and support for everyday man and woman, because clearly there are concerns. People think this is an elitist concern, even though we are all experiencing on a daily basis the impact of climate change. So, okay, moving to what some of us are doing about it. Next slide, please. I think Peter mentioned I was leading a task group as a member of UK Green Construction Board on what we called the Buildings Mission 2030, and it was actually a commitment back in 2018 to halve all building energy use. So that wasn't about better than building regs. That was about pretty clear commitment to energy demand reduction, and it was part of the clean growth strategy of government. And we showed in this report and our recommendations that it is many people, clients who want to achieve what what they set out to do, can have halved building energy use, are halving building energy use. We shouldn't wait till 2030 to do that. It's possible now, and this report was published actually 2 years ago. So we've made a strong case, and we showed many examples across building types of methods and approaches which have actually delivered reduced energy demand, and we've measured that. We have monitored results for that. And many of them were around passive house performance on space heating, by the way. Some of them used contractual mechanisms to oblige their delivery team to work to a specific energy demand target. And I'll show you, if we move on to the next slide, we did a similar exercise. I've been inputting into something called the National Retrofit Strategy, which has been adopted by the Construction Leadership Council. And a similar approach. Basically, you have to bring the demand down, and not least because heat pumps will work in an unsatisfactory way and cost a lot of money to run if you don't have a level of fabric energy efficiency which allows the building to run at a kind of steady state condition. And we were very specific about this. But the approach for the two projects, new build and retrofit, was very similar, and that's why I've showed this little graph here, which is actually from the Energy Sprong, which some of you may be familiar with. But the idea of identifying all the key loads, energy demands in a building, and tackling the ones you can, and pretty much space heating is the absolute sort of killer item on the menu, if you like. but there are other things you can do as well on appliances and more efficient specifications for systems, etc. So again, this is perfectly possible. We've shown examples of where it's been done, but this national retrofit strategy calls on government to put a major initiative in place on retrofit, adequate levels of insulation as well as low carbon systems. So next slide, please. And a similar approach has been taken by UK Green Building Council because, and actually government have been very interested in this idea, which is that similar kilowatt hours per square metre benchmark targets can be adopted, and government have now suggested that there might be a performance benchmarking system based on this, but for non-domestic buildings, for commercial buildings, commercial and industrial buildings actually. But this was the UK Green Building Council's version, which is aligned to the Australian, excuse me, Australian neighbours system, which some of you may know. So it's that issue of converting from a notional specification-led approach to something which is targeting a specific energy demand level, at which we will then be able to cope with in terms of our renewable energy supply. So next slide, please. I, as a member of the Green Construction Board, the Construction Leadership Council will be showcasing at COP this performance framework, which encourages companies to measure against certain benchmarks. And certainly in the consultation version, they referenced the London Energy Transformation Initiative level of energy use intensity. Unfortunately, it hasn't translated into the final version, but some of us are working very hard to make sure that this is taken into account, because it basically addresses this issue of the performance gap. So there are many initiatives going on, but we need to get to that level of precision. So this was the explanatory diagram I did really when I started the Building Mission Report. This might be something you're very familiar with, but this is the way we need to approach things. Identify your key loads in a building and basically look to reduce where you can. So in this case, particularly on domestic buildings, space heat demand is the massive one. And then apply efficient systems, and then you have a much smaller chunk to cope with on renewables. And the same can work for non-domestic buildings, which aligns to the slide I just showed from UK Green Building Council. And that way we will be able to afford and have the capacity to meet our demand through renewable energy. So local authorities, many people in local authorities have grasped this, but there's clearly currently a mismatch between this and national regulation. And there is a nuance about the powers for local authorities to set their own standards. And certainly on the consultation on the Future Home Standard, it was suggested that local authorities might be able to set their own standards. And there are several consultations underway which propose this level of standards, and we're waiting to see whether they pass the inspection and become the requirement in parts of the UK, certainly parts of England. So we're kind of waiting on tenterhooks to hear that, and I'll give you some examples of where that's happening. And just to remind you that this work I did for Green Construction, well, we established a real benchmark of energy use, which you don't get in regulation, basically. So we said, you know, your average house, or the particular house, if you want to make it specific, average performance of new build 140 kilowatt hours per square metre total energy use. Our mission to halve it, 70 kilowatt hours. The benchmark was, we showed people had already done that. That same benchmark was adopted by the RIBA targets in their climate proposal for 2030. And they, in fact, they adopted that target for 2025, which we felt was correct. And then the London Energy Transformation Initiative have said halve it again for net zero. So, you know, the evidence, if you like, for a better version of the road to zero is available, but as yet not taken up by government. Okay, next slide. And by the way, you can do that same exercise on embodied energy. And, you know, this is a really hard nut to crack because we have no regulation on embodied energy at the moment. And we have lots of initiatives, one of them from the London government, GLA, one of them from the RIBA, Royal Institute of British Architects. We now have a group of people who have proposed a building regulation, Part Z, on embodied energy. But there's a strong call for some sort of regulation or government initiative on embodied energy, because Climate Change Committee quite rightly have pointed out that you know, if we manage to nail operational energy, then the embodied energy of materials and components becomes absolutely key. So I won't go into in great detail in that. So I want to move on to where we're going with this local authority-led approach. So many of us have inputted into something called the Whole Life Carbon Sectoral Roadmap, which is being led by the UK Green Building Council and will be showcased at COP alongside other green building councils from parts of the world. And we actually kicked this off in 2013, the Green Construction Board, by interpreting the sectoral targets into a route map. And this is 8 years later, where UK Green Building Council is doing the same thing. And it's a model for the sector based on very precise inputs of energy demand, so that it quantifies quite exactly what we will need for 2050 net zero, and therefore indicates a trajectory. So this isn't about notional buildings. It doesn't assume a performance gap. It shows you exactly what you need to nail. And I think this will be a very powerful piece of work when it's published. It was consulted on recently, and it's available. The consultation version is available on UK Green Building Council website, but it will actually be launched on the Buildings Day at COP. So next slide, please. So I just want to cover really, yeah, thank you, the role of local authorities and city regions. As I've said, they don't have the power to set legislation. There is national legislation, but there is this nuance in the consultation and the future and the energy bill, which allowed a little loophole which says they can set their own standards. So how do they go about doing that, given the high level commitment, but the kind of lack of a really solid route map underneath? So many of them are grasping all this work that's been done, the London Energy Transformation, the RIBA, the UK Green Building Council, those that really want to push the envelope, many of whom, I think 70% now of local authorities have declared a climate emergency. So what does that mean for their commitments and their powers? They have powers in planning, they have powers as developers. Many of them are building homes and buildings for their own use, public buildings. So you know, the first thing to do, as we did for the building mission, is identify where your emissions are currently. And this is the typical one. This is one we did for Cambridgeshire. And it shows that the big purple bit is transport. You know, there's massive emissions from transport movements across this great chunk of Eastern England. But clearly domestic buildings, you know, is a major chunk, and commercial, which includes industrial processes as well. You can see that, you know, our built environment has a huge part to play in that. So the first step that they have to do is analyse where the energy is going. And just like we did for the new build and retrofit proposals, identify where you can reduce. So next one, please. The London plan, although it's benchmarked to building regulations, it has clearly in the new London plan tackled last year, March 21, tackled the issue of performance gaps. So they have introduced this policy for requiring developers to show their energy performance and to verify that it was as designed, as in their submission to the authority. So this is quite a groundbreaking requirement, and we shall see quite how it pans out. But it's clearly a huge driver for developers, and in many cases, works for the investment community, as I said earlier on, to actually invest in something which they know will perform in a certain way. So it's a very powerful mechanism, and and potentially to be adopted elsewhere. So it's a good precedent for other authorities. The other thing they introduced is this whole life carbon assessment, which does have metrics associated with embodied energy. And there's a reporting mechanism to make sure that embodied emissions of materials and construction are taken account of. So these are very, very key moves, I think, in terms of the local authority portfolio. But they haven't really crunched it yet on the energy efficiency precision on the kilowatt hours. But having said that, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, which is a voluntary group of I think up to 1,000 young professionals, have been very influential in this space, and they align with the stuff I was talking about before on the building mission. So they have been a powerful driver, and I think many authorities in London are deferring to them. So next slide, please. So I am working with, under the chairwomanship of the Baroness Brown, formerly Deputy Chair of the Climate Change Committee. And we are part of a commission set up by Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, led by the Mayor of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, to set an overarching strategy for this part of England for all policies which have an impact on climate change, which is basically everything. So thinking back to the pie chart, we have recommendations on transport, we have recommendations on buildings, specifically existing buildings as well as new buildings. And we've recommended, for example, also that they develop local energy planning so that you know precisely how much renewable energy you need in the area, that you can plan to deliver that, and that you can, by knowing that, you can also plan how much district heating networks you need, how much deep renovation you need, etc. So this, I hope, will be a paradigm for the new planning revisions, but it is quite forward thinking. Although one or two authorities related to this area have actually, that means small local authorities have actually are now consulting on specific recommendations which align to this strategy. So we will produce before COP our final version. This is the initial recommendations, which do talk about enforcement of standards, delivering of what it says on the tin, excuse me, making sure that any new development is cited to have access to public transport and EV charging, electric vehicle charging, etc. So it's a kind of joined up approach to agriculture, to water resources, to local energy production, to transportation and buildings, etc. The whole panoply. All things which have to be thought about in terms of planning policy, as well as specific recommendations on buildings if the local authority develops themselves and can influence developer growth. Okay, I think I'm getting there. The other kind of paradigm of local authorities which I wanted to reference is Greater Manchester, because when I was working on the National Retrofit Strategy, I was very impressed with what they've set up in terms of their city-led retrofit programme. So this is based on the idea of a really comprehensive stock model. I talked before about this digital model of you know, the condition and the performance of existing building stock, so that you can identify the finance opportunities, the fuel poverty situation, you know, whether grants could be applied or whatever. It's a really comprehensive strategy. And since this was published, I think last year, they also now have added an announcement on 30,000, they're saying zero carbon homes. So we're waiting to see what exactly that means in terms of the precision on zero carbon homes. But they've shown great ambition, and again, a bit like Cambridge and Peterborough, this idea of really connecting, you know, other bits of the economy, thinking about the social justice implications, identifying fuel poverty as a key thing that needs to be addressed. So I think last but not least, I think if I have the last couple of slides, please. Next one. Thank you. So yes, I chair the Good Homes Alliance. We have, I think it's now 25 local authority members, and also a growing network of housing associations. And we are putting together a whole pack, if you like, of what we think is best practice in terms of policy, in terms of delivery requirements like procurement methods, employers' requirements, etc., and precise definitions of specifications for embodied energy as well as for operational energy reduction. So there's a whole suite of resources which we've put together for all these local authorities, all of whom have declared climate emergency, all of whom will be developing their own portfolio of new social rent housing. And you know, again, a bit like the Cambridge and Peterborough, it must address also the quality of place, greening, street trees, etc., water conservation, so that, you know, it's a rounded piece in terms of a net zero journey that is also equitable and really long-term sustainable. And I think next one or last one. So underpinning this, we're working on Build Net Zero Now campaign, which is a precision on the targets and whether they're monitored. This is for air quality, for operational energy, for embodied energy, for healthy living criteria, for biodiversity net gain. It's the whole kind of range of criteria, if you like, for successful and net zero development. So I hope that makes some sense. I encourage you to respond to these ambitions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynne, and very comprehensive again, and a lot of information there. We are running a little bit over time, but we did say we'd promise some questions and answers. So perhaps we just field 2 or 3 quick questions. There's one that, and may I quickly invite Tom and Chris to rejoin as well. I hope you are still with us. Excellent. Hi. Lynne, just to start with you, Lynne, we did have a question. It was specifically targeted at you, I think, because it was referring to a co-housing project in Cambridge. How do you see the future of community-led co-housing development, and how do you see the role of the public authority to enhance this?
Well, I think this diversification of development is really something both government and local government want. And there have been some fantastic examples of co-housing and community-led development, which have delivered on placemaking and energy performance, because, you know, they're a self-selecting group. They are committed, and, you know, I think without exception, committed to the net zero agenda. So those are fantastic examples of actually, you know, having delivered it. And certainly in Cambridgeshire, if it's the one I'm thinking of, yeah, the Cambridgeshire Authority provided, I think, the site, or certainly enabled the provision of that site. So that's very important, to enable those early adopters and the exemplars to flourish.
So really indicating exactly how important the local councils are as well in terms of approaching We did have a question right at, well, a long time ago now, right at the beginning, about how similar. I think Chris, perhaps you can answer this. How you've given us an indication about the market landscape in the UK. How similar would you say that the market landscape is in other, should we say, other Anglosphere countries, and particularly Australia was mentioned. I don't know if you, if that would be within your area of expertise, but could you give us more on that?
I'd say they're fairly similar. My experience of working in various countries around the world is there are broad similarities. Obviously, specific legislation is different. The stages of implementation of such things as zero carbon are at different points, but very broadly speaking, it's very much the same. The same in the United States. I found for me the big difference in the United States was that they used slightly different words for the meanings, which I guess for somebody who's not got English as their first language would be even more challenging. But broadly speaking, they're very similar. And I might also add, from what I've seen in the European Union, again, it's very, very similar. I'd say it's primarily the stage of implementation that's different from one country to another. Oh, okay. Can I just add something else? Earlier on, you were asking me about the Code for Construction Product Information. I see that while this webinar has been taking place, they've actually launched it this morning. So the code is now available. So maybe we can get a link for that.
We'll try and send a link out when we send the presentations after the event. Another question is perhaps I don't, Tom, you can answer this. Another question's coming about when can we expect to see new funding schemes for renewable energy? I don't know whether who would. I guess because we've had a sort of. I think we're expecting some more schemes to replace those schemes which have kind of been put on hold or have run their course. Anyone got an idea of when the new schemes are going to come in? Tom.
Well, I'll give an initial view on it, and so there's a lot of money going into housing retrofit. So there's £1 billion programme, something like that, going into housing retrofit. It started a year or so ago, just over a year, and goes up until the end of March 2023. So there's a lot of money going into housing retrofits, but it's quite complex in terms of how it's structured. So I don't think it includes batteries. It does include solar PV, but it does depend on somebody's income. It does depend on the property type and what have you. To what extent there will be specific funding for renewables, I don't know. Are you thinking in terms of your Austrian companies that are feeding into the renewables sector?
I think it's probably in terms of probably in terms of there have been funded. I think it was the Green Homes grant, wasn't it? Which was
yeah. Well, the
green specifically in terms of renewables, I think you know your questioner may have been thinking about things like the feed-in tariff. You know.
Yes.
Certain measures. As Tom says, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund has identified things like PVs, but I think we're waiting on the heat in buildings strategy to get a really clear steer on you know where they see you know the key technologies and then possibly grants to follow.
Okay, that's very good.
The Green Homes grant, a lot of the titles changed. So the Green Homes grant has been superseded by a project called the Local Authority Delivery Scheme, but that is within the £1 billion housing retrofits I'm referring to, as is the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. And when I was saying in my presentation, there is a lot of investment happening, but it is communicated in a helpful way. That's an example of how it is communicated in an unhelpful way. But that's why, to some extent, my advice is I wouldn't focus too much on the policy coming out, because the policy in itself is often, you have to be a bit careful what you wish for. But the trajectory is towards net zero. There are national targets enshrined in law that take us there. So the challenge is quite a difficult one, which is find the companies to talk to that are on that trajectory, that are pushing into that space. I think if your marketing, I'm not saying this is the case, but if your marketing is a bit dependent on policy and a bit dependent on subsidy, that isn't really a viable way forward, because it changes so frequently and it isn't always structured in a particularly helpful way.
Okay, that's a very good point. Perhaps one more quick one. You mentioned the Brexit impact. Is there a requirement for local content, or are clients still receptive to imports? Chris?
I don't think attitudes have changed since pre-Brexit. So in my experience, specifiers, contractors have never been anti-non-British content. Their main concern is about the support and the availability they get. And I don't think there's been any change in attitude as a result of Brexit. That would be my view. I don't know how, well, Tom obviously has an opinion as well.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think in terms of, so one of the roles which I'm carrying out at the moment is as manager of the North Eastern Yorkshire Energy Hub. So that's one of 5 energy hubs in England, and we have a very significant housing retrofit programme working through local authorities, and those local authorities are extremely keen on local investment, on local opportunities. But the thing to realise is that doesn't mean that they won't support good quality imported products. What you do need to talk about is what your local economic impact is, because you will have a local economic impact in terms of how you train people, in terms of the skills that you give to installers. We have the Future Homes Standard coming up very, very soon on the horizon. There is a big skills gap in terms of that. So if you are feeding a product into the new build market, it will have a retrofit impact in terms of skills and training. If you are feeding into the retrofit market, again, it will have an impact on the new build skills and training. So it's not so much that you are on the back foot because you make your product elsewhere, but what you do need to do is be aware of what your story is about local economic impact, about how you're investing in communities, how you're training people and giving them skills. And the other thing is supply chain resilience. We have a real problem in the UK in terms of supply chain resilience. There are far too many companies who are one contract away from failure. So if you treat your supply chain based in the UK in a respectful way, and you work with them on the basis of long-term value, then again, that's stories that you can talk to when you're talking to potential clients. And those stories will be more important than whether your product is made in Austria or in the UK.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks very much for that. I think we've run over a little bit now, so there was a question about skill shortages as well, but I think that kind of covers that a bit as well. But I think it's time really to wind up the proceedings now. I'd like to firstly thank our panelists, so Lynne, Tom and Chris. Thank you very much for taking your time this morning to give us a wealth of information. We were asked actually there, and you've already mentioned it, I think alluded to it, Tom, the presentations will be available and sent to the participants, your participants, after the event. And the recording of the event will be made available on our YouTube website, which I think might be overleaf. I will just mention before we wind up, we've already mentioned at the beginning that this is part of a focus that we have on green building and particularly energy efficiency in construction, and a couple of events coming up in the next few months to be aware of. We are currently organising the Austrian Pavilion at the Future Build, which is actually taking place, not virtually, in London on the first week of March, and registrations are live for that. So if anybody's interested in that, please get in touch. We're going to have a showcase of innovation there and a large pavilion there. So, and finally, I just mentioned that we have in May we have the Future of Building conference at our headquarters in Vienna, which is always a flagship event for the sector in Austria, and we're planning to bring a delegation of UK stakeholders to that event. And again, I'd urge you to get involved in that. There's a big program of one-to-one meetings, as well as an exhibition and international conference with experts also coming from all around the world. So that's just a couple of things to bear in mind. I'll thank you all now very much for your attention. It's been a long session, but with lots of information. Please feel free to look it up again. And the link here is for our YouTube. You'll see this recording shortly. And otherwise, I'll say again, thank you very much to Lynne, to Tom, and to Chris. It's been a very informative session, and thank you, and see you all again soon.